Welcome. My name is Charles Epstein. I am the host of the Catalyst podcast. Today, we're joined by Dr. Yifrah Kaminer, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Pediatrics with the Alcohol Research Center, University of Connecticut School of Medicine. Dr. Kaminer is a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training, focusing on clinical research of the assessment, treatment, and continuity of care of high-risk behaviors, particularly substance use disorders in youth. He has special interest in comorbid depressive disorders and suicidal behaviors. Yifrah has authored, edited 6 books, co-authored more than 180 scientific publications, has also developed several rating scales and manuals, including the Teen Addiction Severity Index. Yifrah, welcome. Did I miss anything?
Well, you missed the most important thing. It's my recent 2 children books and 1 play, but I can address it later. People can find it on Amazon if you search my name.
Actually, I want to address that right at the outset. You know, we had a conversation, and a lot of people who may know of your work, who are just finding out about it, I'm sure will be surprised that you're also a writer of children's books. My first question is, how did this start?
Well, I kind of realized that a lot of people are dually diagnosed. They're known as doing this or working on that, but they have a hobby or something else they're doing. For me, it has been writing. I've been writing since age 8 because I can't draw, so I focused on writing. And I published in the past science fiction stories, a poetry book. But recently, in the last several years, I wanted to finish a lot of works that I've started and moved on to something new. So I finally published 2 children books. One is called The Secret of the Chocolate Tree, which talks about how chocolate is being made after a discussion with my kids. Is chocolate a fruit or a vegetable? In order to coax them to eat fruit and vegetables, and they say, hey, I wish chocolate would have grown on trees. And I said, as a matter of fact, chocolate does grow on trees, on the cocoa tree. So it became a very funny, kind of lovely book with illustrations. The second book is called Alice's Lost Time Wonder. My most favorite book is Alice in Wonderland. And I had the audacity to write a sequel to the Mad Hatter Tea Party. What happens if Alice somehow, some way, has the privilege of visiting Wonderland 20 years later? Who are the protagonists? What's going to happen? And so on. So this book also came out last year with amazing illustrations, and I'm extremely, extremely happy. And I apologize to the late Lewis Carroll for my audacity to try to write a sequel to this iconic book. The third book that just came out 2 weeks ago, actually, it's written as a play, and the audience actually is adults. It's called Elijah, Politically Incorrect Prophet, Future Past, and politically incorrect, instead of the letter C, inserted the letters K. This is a mystical, psychological drama that takes place in a psychiatric emergency room in Boston. And it has to do, I don't want to, steal the thunder, has to do with the sorry state of the world we live in, given global warming, what's happening now in Los Angeles, tsunamis, and in Southeast Asia, and hurricanes, how Elijah, the prophet, who connects between the upper world and our world, and is the one who's supposed to arrive the arrival of the Messiah, get integrated into what's going on. And again, illustrations done by the same wonderful person who illustrated my other books. And I don't know, I'm hoping it's written as a play that maybe some play company would pick it up. So, so this is, and I'm working on my next book, but that's something.
So it's actually written in the form of a play, dialogue.
It's written in a form of play, dialogue, monologue, quadrilogues, and so forth. Yeah.
Fascinating. And this came out 2 weeks ago, did you say?
Exactly. It came out actually the last week of December. It came Christmas and Hanukkah and Diwali and Kwanzaa holiday, it all came on the last week. So, hey guys, if it's not too late, please buy it as a present to yourself, if not to others.
Yeah, no, it sounds really, really great. I mean, you bring a lot to the topic for sure, and obviously available at Amazon.
Yeah, indeed it is.
Excellent.
And of course, it's also humorous, there's a lot of black humor in it as well as some other interesting dialogue.
Yeah, I was a little bit afraid to lead with this. I was really interested, and the reason I say that is that this could be the topic of an entire conversation, an entire podcast. I have so many questions about your work in this area, but maybe in part two, Yifrah.
Thank you.
Anyway, again, I really do appreciate you coming on, spend some time with us today to discuss your very important work. So let me just back up a second. You received your MD from Connecticut School of Medicine, Tel Aviv University. What prompted you to go into psychiatry, and why the focus on children and adolescents? Perhaps it's one and the same.
Well, I originally wanted to be a pediatric neurologist. I was very interested in epilepsy, and particularly with temporal lobe epilepsy, which has psychiatric manifestations that are very interesting and very unique. And I've done some research on the subject, and then I said, wait a minute, actually the psychiatric manifestations of temporal lobe epilepsy are of more interest to me than the EEG and what's happening in the infrastructure of the brain. So I gravitated into child and adolescent psychiatry. But during my training, I gravitated even more into adolescents because I like the energy, the confusion, the identity issues of adolescents, and the fact that most psychopathologies emerge, and also those that exist already, their severity reaches a high during adolescence, where impulsivity and sensation seeking are usually at their highest level. And of course, what we do as a society when our rules and regs and legal, implications are not relying on developmentally informed issues. So if impulsivity and sensation seeking reach their peak at between age 15 and 16, what do? We give our darlings at age 16 license to be killed and to kill, which is driving, even though they are at the worst point of their life to make decisions on a dime when it happens when you are a new driver, and no wonder we have so many casualties on the road among young drivers.
Now, why the focus on suicidal intentionality?
Well, this is one of the most painful high-risk behaviors that leads to death. Some people are more into self-injurious behavior. I fortunately got fascinated by suicide and suicidal behavior. I also, I think I'm a literature buff as well as movies buff. And there is an article that just came out that reviewed suicide in Shakespeare's writing. And a fascinating article, how many times suicide or the wish to die is basically intertwined in Shakespeare's work. Also, it is preventable in many cases. And, the worst thing that can happen to a parent is to lose a child by suicide. Even the guilt feelings and the shame and the doubts that really tear parents apart. So I kind of got into the depression, suicide, if you will, continuity research, and collaborated with some other people who are more primary suicide researchers. But I definitely am versed in the literature. Also took a training by the American Suicide Association to conduct psychological autopsies, which is, let's say, the analysis that you do post-death to find out how and why young people committed suicide, and kind of do retrograde analysis or engineering of the process, because we want to find to hit the nail on the head just before they make the final decision to commit suicide, because the urge to do it is waxing and waning, like drinking, for example, as an example. So if we would be able to learn how to do it, and there are some interventions based on it, we would hopefully be able to reduce suicidal behavior. But suicidal intentionality that I'm interested in, particularly within this terrible epidemic we experience of drug overdose, is a pivotal issue in my interest in my research right now.
Yeah, no, interesting. By the way, I got to dig into that suicidal ideation in Shakespeare. The only play that obviously immediately comes to mind is Romeo and Juliet. So, but you're talking about ideation, so it's not necessarily the taking of one's life, but just a line or a thought that moves in that direction.
I'll try to find it and send it to you. It's fascinating.
Please.
Because I like Shakespeare stuff, and whenever I have a chance to see Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde, stuff, I see time and time again and read it time and time again.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. By the way, sort of a little bit of a footnote, you focus on quote unquote youth, and your focus extends to people up to the age of 25. Why 25? Why is that a significant number?
Very interestingly, unlike most things in life and in the world, the brain does not develop from the front to the back, but from the back to the front. So the brain matures around age 25, at least biologically, the way we know it. Although I know some people, including myself, that probably the brain is still in a maturation process that hopefully one day will be concluded. But there is an area of the brain that's called the prefrontal cortex, and this area is the last to be concluded and developed. So the brain is quote unquote under construction with adolescents, and we need to take it into consideration. When we work with them, they are not completed in terms of brain development. Why is the prefrontal cortex so important? Because this is the area that's supposed to use inhibition to slow down or inhibit unwanted behavior, because there's a lot of pressure from the limbic system, which is the area that is responsible, if you will, for immediate gratification and satisfaction. Or as I say to parents, this is the gimme part of the brain. And the pathway to the prefrontal cortex is very important, because the prefrontal cortex is trying to delay immediate gratification and high-risk behavior. And it sends back the response and the pathway to the limbic system: don't do it, or slow down now. Unfortunately, because the brain of adolescents is still in under construction, the response is not strong enough and definite enough, like in adults say, no, don't do it. It is kind of a little bit wobbly, and that's why adolescents don't get the message or interpret it the way they want, engage in high behavior, and that's why we have the casualties. As you know, the three main killers of youth in the world are preventable. There are car crashes, suicide, and homicide.
Yeah, very interesting. You had an epiphany several years ago that the SUD problem, substance use disorder problem among youth, is not homogeneous. It needs to be broken down. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, similarly to other diseases and disorders, we tend to simplify things. Since I mentioned epilepsy, there's not one kind of epilepsy. There are epilepsies of different kind of the brain, different parts of the brain, and different kind, like petit mal or grand mal. There's not one disease called schizophrenia. There are the schizophrenias. There's not only one depression. There are mood disorders. So likewise, it kind of makes sense that in the addiction field, there are some, there's a great heterogeneity, but for practical purposes, we would like to break it down into a smaller, more homogeneous subgroups and address them one at a time, because we cannot address it all as a complete matter, because it's more complex than it is.
I see. Yifrah, the topic I'd like to focus on is your research into drug overdoses and suicidality among this cohort. First, give us an overview of your most recent research, its aims, how it was conducted, the most salient findings, and perhaps the most surprising findings.
Well, I conducted it's some kind of a ladder of studies, and I hope to be able to get more funding for more of them, because as much as people talk about overdose so much, and it has led to the death of more than 110,000 Americans in 2022, 2023, there's not enough research on it. And, everybody just talked about naloxone, but naloxone is only a mean to an end. Many people who are being revived by naloxone when they OD have done it again and again and again. And what people also don't probably know is the fact that you save their life does not mean that you stop the addictive process and behavior. And in addition to that, there is, to a certain level degree, from small to a large degree, brain damage, because when they are under the influence of opioid that affect the breathing area in the medulla oblongata of the brain, some areas of the brain do not get enough oxygen. Similarly to myocardial infarction, when the heart muscle does not get the blood that carries oxygen, so there is brain damage. And again, similarly to some degree to TBI that our troops have suffered in Afghanistan and Iraq, traumatic brain injury due to lack of oxygen, and repeated overdose increases the damage. So those people are damaged even though they've been saved. So that's a very important issue to understand.
Sure. What about this alarming trend where kids as young as middle schoolers have had suicidal thoughts, made attempts as a consequence of SUD? It appears that you're finding this is getting to kids younger and younger. Why is this?
Okay, there are two parts to your question, actually, and allow me to elaborate your question a little bit. First of all, since the 1990s, we have seen a constant, continuous increase in depression. And the late Professor Gerald Kellerman from New York in the 1990s termed the 1990s as the age of melancholy. Little did he know, although maybe he predicted it, that it will continue to grow and grow and grow. So now, roughly speaking, about 1 of every 5 children qualified for major depressive episode. Secondly, since 2007, after all kind of ups and downs, there have been a steady increase in suicide prevalence among young people. And it keeps on growing and growing and growing. This is even before we talk about substance use related issues.
So wait a second. Let me just interrupt you for a moment. So before 2007, it was 1 in 5.
So in terms of depression now the rate of depression among U.S. children and adolescents is about 1 to 5. 20% of kids qualify for major depressive episode. This is huge. Among those, by the way, the likelihood to develop substance use disorder is significantly higher than those who are not depressed. And also the opposite is true. Those who have substance use disorder have a high likelihood to develop depression. Now, suicide, which its probability increases with any psychiatric disorder, whether there is depression or substance use, and definitely the combination of both, has also been growing steadily since 2007 in the United States. So we have several epidemics here, if you will. We have a depression epidemic, we have a suicide epidemic, and we have an overdose epidemic. Suicide in the United States for all ages is approaching 50,000 people a year.
Wow.
And overdose, more than 100,000. Hopefully it's going to be a little less, a little more, but it's still very, very high. And there's all kind of other figures. So what we have found in Connecticut, a small sample, but it's Connecticut, that overdose, lethal overdose, fatal overdose, the number is more than the combination of road crashes, suicide, and homicide. So drug overdose has become the kind of, if you will, the monster that is the number one killer when you address issues that pertain to mental health related, consequences.
Now I know you separate between passive and active planning vis-a-vis lethality or suicide. How do those numbers break down as far as the broad number and passive and active planning?
Okay, so based on several studies, I would say roughly speaking, the majority of drug overdose is accidental. However, there are studies that show that between 10 to 20% drug overdose lethality is pre-planned, meaning it's suicidal. And that's something a lot of people do not discuss. Now, is it binary or is it more like a trend along a range? It's probably more a trend along the range, and I'll explain to you why, based on studies conducted at McLean Hospital near Boston by Hillary Connery, Roger Weiss, and their team. So they found out among survivors of overdose, young people who are survivors, that what we call passive is the people who say, listen, I'm aware that whenever I take a hit of opioid, particularly fentanyl, there is a chance that I will die. But so be it. I want to get high, and if I'm going to die, so be it. Sounds almost like an Iggy Pop song. There is such a song, by the way. We're all going to die, so let's get high. So that's a passive. The active is people who say, look, there is a buffet of means to an end. You can shoot yourself, you can hang yourself, but I have access to drugs, I have access to fentanyl. It's probably going to be, not such a bad way in terms of the pain of my final seconds. So I'm going to use it in order to perish. So that's more of the active one. Now, the correlation between the two is pretty high. It's about 0.6. So basically, people on both, so to speak, groups move to the other group and move back and move forth and move back. So it's a matter of timing, like suicide. Why somebody committed suicide right now? Well, they tried several times, they had the plan, but the timing and the momentum were right to do it, and they had to meet the means, and that's why it's so important to limit means of suicide among young people. So if they won't find it, they probably will have the impulse that is pretty high, as I mentioned anyway, and it will pass until the next time, of course.
Yeah. You mentioned that we're going through a depression and a suicide epidemic. We're obviously also going through an opioids epidemic. So the question I have for you is, how does legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes affect opioids use, particularly among this cohort?
Good question. But first of all, in general, I have nothing positive to say about cannabis legalization. The research shows that all those states that started early in cannabis legalization, medicalization, legalization for recreational purposes, deal with a lot of negative consequences. I don't want to get into it. If you want, it's kind of an old story. This will take an hour. I wrote some reviews, and most recently we got the report from the Canadian experiment. 2018, they started legalizing it. All the findings from road crashes to adolescents-related negative outcomes are heartbreaking. So that's negative. There haven't been a lot of studies that show exactly causation between use of cannabis and use of opioid. We sometimes try to be more careful and talk about association. Causation is that A leads to B. You were in a road accident and you broke your arm. That's causation. Association is A may lead to B, but through the mediation of C. But I can tell you that a lot of studies that saw association in terms of number, and there was a study actually conducted in Connecticut, I was not involved in it, that showed among 5,000 high schoolers that those who use cannabis had a very much higher likelihood of using any other drugs, including opioids. So you have to start with something. You start with alcohol, you start with tobacco, you don't usually start with opioids. But for some of those kids who are impulsive and have sensation-seeking behavior, the high is not good enough. So they are searching for something that will give them a better high, and they gravitate into stimulants, into cocaine, into opioids, and some of them accidentally use fentanyl that they don't even know what they're using because it's very seductive, the colors of the pills, and it looks like marshmallows, and it is highly lethal. And you can say that probably there are two kinds of populations here. One is those who have substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, they know what they want to use. But there's also those adolescents that perish out of the blue unknowingly because they've never been known to have substance use disorders. They took something and it was laced with fentanyl, or they didn't know what it is, but somebody told them, hey, get it, you're going to get high, and because they are sensation seekers, and they died. And this is a major tragedy and shock to the family because these are quote-unquote kids who have not been troubled by mental health and substance use disorders, but experimented with the forbidden drug that leads to their demise.
Yifrah, what are some of the common misconceptions about this cohort as they relate to underlying causes and treatment?
I don't know if there are a lot of misconceptions. As I said, the first group are people who do suffer and being identified with substance use disorders, and that put them at jeopardy of more morbidity, more mortality. Not to mention, if we talk about adolescents in high school, if they use drugs, there's high likelihood to get suspended and won't graduate, and then later on won't be part of the working force. So it's a slippery slope that can end up, particularly with opioids, in tragedy. And we are playing cops and robbers here. Now everybody's concerned about fentanyl, but guess what? There are new drugs coming out that are stronger than fentanyl and are more lethal than fentanyl. So anytime somebody will be exposed to them, it increases the likelihood of death. For example, one of them is called carfentanil. And carfentanil is 50 times more lethal than fentanyl. It is 50 times more lethal than heroin.
Crazy.
And it's just a matter of time when people will be more aware of it. Right now, only medical examiners and some sketchy reports about it just came out. But you're going to see by the time 2025 is over, everybody will know what carfentanil is. And there are some other drugs as well that are in the pipeline, you know.
Always. I think actually the proper question is not so much about misconceptions, just simply the extent to which people don't know the extent of the problem. Some of the things that are looming, some of these new drugs that are coming in, how attractively they're packaged, how people don't exactly know what's in them. Yeah, so again, it's not so much a misconception as it is, this is operating in the shadows. A lot of people just don't know this is happening.
Well, that's why prevention should start in elementary school, middle school, and definitely high school is too late. Secondly, we have done review and analysis of death certificates of young people that have been interested in the office of the Connecticut Medical Examiner. And unfortunately, there have been several cases already of kids under the age of 16 that perished due to the use of fentanyl. Of course, it was accidental, but it just shows you that the kids have access to it. And there's a paper that just came out on Pediatrics a couple of months ago that showed that about 1,700 young people from age 0 to 16 perished between 2004 and 2020 because they actually had accidental overdose. And this is really an alarm call for parents who are using drugs and for those who know, such as DCF workers and social workers, but parents who use drugs and they have children in the house, that the children are at a higher likelihood of danger to die, especially if they're using opioids. Not to mention that kids of parents who use drugs are, of course, at a high risk to develop mental health and substance abuse issues later on. So this is another lost generation, and already their potential children, the third generation, also will be at disadvantage.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, you move us into the next question, which of course the biggest question: what can be done? We know that awareness is important, and clearly a lot of work needs to be done in raising awareness. But from a policy standpoint, what can
Okay,
be done?
the most important issue, and that I think our systems are not doing very well, even though we spend more money per capita on health issues, is access to services. It's become pretty clear, particularly among opioid use disorders, that being in treatment in methadone maintenance clinic reduces dramatically the likelihood of drug overdose. And we don't have enough services, and there's not enough funding for them. And usually these services are really at the places that are kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard, that it's difficult to access them, or kind of industrialized area and stuff like this. And this location should be at the mainstream areas wherever there is mental health services, because the majority of people with substance disorders have also co-occurring disorders. They have mental health issues, depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, and so forth. So I think that it makes more sense to forget the old paradigm or concept and break down mental health and substance use into two separate entities. The entities should be integrated, and treatment of substance use disorders should clearly have also a mental health component, what we call dual diagnosis services. And we are even behind on this even more than on substance use services.
What could be done from a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint? I know you've written about contingency management, which is basically rewards, incentives to get people to move from bad behaviors to positive ones. What can you say about that?
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy is the least expensive, more, if you will, most economical approach for treatment that matches in terms of quality all other interventions. You can also use it in group settings, and therefore it probably should be the recommended approach. Besides, sometimes when you talk about opioids, getting opioid supported treatment, which includes methadone maintenance, buprenorphine, and so-called that deal with the craving issue, that is very powerful. So yeah, absolutely. Any intervention, and definitely cognitive behavioral therapy that we use quite often, and you can pair it with contingency management and so forth, could be helpful.
This is a pretty grim and unsettling topic. So maybe I could ask you to reach deep within and leave us with something hopeful.
I don't know. I like fantasy and fairy tales, like my Alice in Wonderland stuff, but we need to be very pragmatic. I would like to see more action. I have concerns about where the money goes, and all these, I don't know, blue, yellow, red ribbon committees that I hear about. I'm not part of them, unfortunately. So I don't know what people do. There's a lot of silos in the field. I'd like to see more funding, the same way that it was for AIDS, for the overdose epidemic, because a lot of research is necessary, and we need these research results in order to implement it in the trenches. We just need more services, and we need more funding, and we definitely need to beat up the drums. And let me get on my soapbox, apropos Hyde Park, speaker corners. In this country and in other Western countries, people protest anything. They will march for every cause. The only cause I've never seen anybody march on the Bastille, which is the government, is improve access to substance use services. Nobody's protesting it. Nobody's going up in the streets, because there's a lot of shame and guilt, and you'd rather say, my kid perished because of a disease or an accident or malignancy, but nobody is going and say, we are parents of kids who perished because of drug use, And you guys, you legislators that get money paid by our tax money, you won't leave the chambers until you do something about it besides just talking. So I'm kind of instigating and manipulating. There need to be a certain revolt, and to make it very clear to our representatives, if you won't be able to represent us and improve access to treatment, you better go get yourself another job, because you are not our representative.
Okay, excellent. I think you gave me a good idea for the title of this podcast, To the Barricades, Conversation with Dr. Yifrah Kaminer.
Les Miserables, there's this song in Les Miserables when they're all on the barricades,
Right, yes.
Yeah, but of course they lose, but.
Yes. One last question. You've been in the field some 35 years, and I'm going to give you options. We can go in any of the following three directions. You could answer one of the following three, entirely up to you. You could answer all three of them, or just two of the three. That's how we roll on this podcast, Yifrah. We're very, very open-ended here. Very, very flexible.
Is there cheese at the end of the maze?
I'm sorry?
Is there cheese at the end of the maze?
There is. There is always, yes.
Okay.
You which is a beautiful conversation and podcast you get to share with your friends and family and cohort. So let me ask you one of three questions, or you can answer all three. Looking back, is there anything you do differently? Number one. Is there one thing in your professional life that has given you the greatest reward? Or three, how does your work make you a better writer of children's books?
Okay, again, we come back to the issue of association causation. First of all, I've realized that I like to work with adolescents, that many people wouldn't touch them with 10-foot pole, maybe because I have a little bit of this immature aspect of adolescence, impulsivity, sensation seeking, and so forth. So even though, I have a handicap of being a grown-up, and adolescents never believed that we were adolescents and they can learn from our experience, I have been gratified that I chose to work with the kids that many people wouldn't touch. I don't know. I can feel connected with them. I feel that they, to gain the trust is not easy, but the interaction is interesting. And I can tell you when I teach or present to people, I tell them, do you know what an adolescent is all about? And of course they say no. I said, I'll give you an example. Imagine you're walking on the sidewalk on a rainy day, blustery day, and there's a little pup soaked to its bone, and its shaggy hair cover its face, and you decide to pet the pet. And instinctively, the pet will decide whether to lick you or to bite you. That's an adolescent. So you need to convey to them a certain level of safety and trust, even though you are grown up and you don't know anything because you are a grown up. So this is how you deal with this, human being at a developmental stage when the brain is still under construction, where they are being bombarded by hormones, impulsive and sensation seeking, push, and they are all over the place. So they are work in progress, and working with them is very difficult because some of them have not reached the capacity of their negativity and outcome, but we are here to slow down the process and hopefully even to stop it. So that's kind of my interconnection with adolescents.
Excellent. And one last thing, Yifrah, for anybody in our listening audience who produces theatrical productions, again, the name of your recent book
is Elijah, Politically Incorrect Prophet, Column, Future Path. This is a contemporary psychological thriller with environmental implications. And it is, has some dark humor in it, but we live in difficult times environmentally, and the human race has no grace, and we are showing it time and time again. So this book kind of deals with these issues in a play format.
Okay, so if the book turns out to be produced, thanks to this conversation and podcast, I expect to be receiving 2 tickets in the mail for opening night, Yifrah.
Not only that, front row.
Front row. By the way, I used to do reviews of movies and theater. And I know from my experience that front row is probably not the best place to see. So 8th row would be optimal.
No, I agree because you got some neck problems.
Yes, which I'm suffering from right now. Yes, exactly. Anyway, Yifrah, I really do appreciate you spending time with us today on this very important topic and the work you're doing on it. So thanks so much.
Okay, one quick comment. If
Sure.
anybody who's listening interested in relevant publication that I had, they can just shoot me an email to kaminer@uchc.edu. And thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Yifrah. Today I spoke with Dr. Yifrah Kaminer, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Pediatrics with the Alcohol Research Center, University of Connecticut School of Medicine, about his important work on substance use disorders and suicidal ideation among our nation's youth. I'm Charles Epstein for the Catalyst Podcast. Thanks for listening.